Welcome, everybody, to the third of our four seminars in the East Asia and Pacific Technology and Development Month. Paul Krugman said, perhaps too memorably, that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And the drivers of productivity are firms, businesses, enterprises. The question we address today, based on our new book, Firm Foundations of Growth, is what is happening to productivity in East Asia and the Pacific? Why? And what can be done to revive productivity? We will begin today with an introduction by the World Bank Chief Economist and Senior Vice President, Indamit Gill, who is now our intellectual leader and who in 2007 originated the idea of a middle income trap in his book with Homi Karas, precisely on this region. The book was called An East Asian Renaissance, Ideas for Economic Growth. That book remains relevant, and he more recently led a World Development Report, again on the idea and the problem of a middle income trap. So, Indamit, why don't you begin today's conversation?
Thank you very much, Aditya. And I would also like to welcome you all to the launch of this new book, Firm Foundations of Growth. All three of the authors are on this call. So the focus of the discussion today is going to be on the drivers of productivity growth in East Asia and the links between productivity growth and technological progress. Now, these are important subjects for two reasons. The first is that if you look back at the East Asian growth success, you'd find that 75% of the growth in output has come from greater investment or greater capital accumulation. Less than 20% of it has come from increased productivity or greater efficiency. Now, an over reliance on investment means an underperformance in consumption and living standards. So, the question, of course, is East Asia paying too high a price in terms of welfare with this focus on investment as a way to increase output? The second, of course, is that productivity growth rates have been declining recently, and they've been declining at a time when technological change is speeding up. So, why is this the case? So these are the questions that this book tries to answer, and the answers are important for three reasons. The first is that productivity growth in East Asia has come mainly from firms getting better at using capital, labor, and energy. That is, productivity growth has not come from the reallocation of capital and talent and energy resources to more productive firms. And this is worrying because there are natural limits to within firm progress in productivity. The second is that while there has been a convergence in productivity levels between leading and lagging firms in most East Asian economies, this is a good thing. East Asia's leading firms are falling behind the global leaders. And again, this is something that should worry East Asian policymakers a lot. Now, the third is that the productivity of the national frontier firms has been falling behind, especially in digital intensive sectors. So, for example, in digital manufacturing sectors, the productivity of the global frontier increased by 76% between 2005 and 2015, while the national frontier firms in countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam increased their productivity by only 34% on average. And the book finds that one reason for this is that the gap in technology use between East Asia's most sophisticated firms and the world's most sophisticated firms has widened, much more so than the gap between the average East Asian firm and their global counterparts. Now, the best firms globally have shifted their business models from investing in tangible capital like factories and machines to investing in intangibles like data and business processes. So, for example, in advanced economies, investment in data increased from about 0.5% of GDP in 2011 to 0.7% of GDP in 2018. But data investment has stagnated at around just 0.1% in East Asia and the Pacific. So, this era of rapid technological change offers huge opportunities. But as you can see from these numbers, it listening to the authors and the so I'm going to hand the mic back to Aditya so he gets the serious part of the discussion started. Thank you, Aditya, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Indamit. You have already started the serious part of this discussion, but now I turn to my two co-authors, Francesca De Nicola and Jonathan Timmis, to tell us about the essence of this book.
Thank you. Let me just share our slides. Excellent. So thank you so much for the warm welcome, Aditya and Indamit. So this is our book on firm foundations of growth. And I'll be presenting initially on the puzzle of the productivity slowdown in East Asia and why that productivity growth has slowed. And then I'll pass on to Francesca, who will talk about why the leading firms in East Asia are not leading, why they're falling behind, and what can be done. So we're living at a time of rapid technological progress. It's changing how our firms produce. For example, robots are widely used in car production. And here's an example from a factory in Thailand. It's changing how customers interact with firms. Many people regularly use platforms, for example, to do their online shopping, and as well as transport or even banking and finance. And here's an example of one app in the Philippines. And technology is rapidly changing how firms make decisions. So Indamit already talked about data and the rising availability of data. And this is helping firms shift towards data-driven decision-making. And here's an example of a cloud computing data center in China to process all that data. Yet, despite all this technological change we see around us, productivity growth has slowed. It's slowed in advanced economies. And here's a chart where we first show the US, but in advanced economies, productivity growth has slowed down over recent decades. But it slowed down even more in East Asian economies, including China. And this is from countries where you would expect even faster growth because of the potential scope for catch-up. So if technology is advancing so fast, why isn't productivity catching up? So to look at this, I'm first going to present a framework for how we think about aggregate growth. So aggregate productivity growth, and by that I mean total factor productivity, can come from productivity improvements within existing firms. This is existing firms doing things more efficiently. This could be the best firms, the best frontier firms improving what they're doing, and it could be catch-up of the rest of the firms within an economy. And one important channel for this is technologies, which tend to arrive first at these most productive firms and then diffuse more gradually to firms throughout the economy. But this isn't the only channel of productivity growth. Also, if you have entry of more productive firms or exit of less productive firms, that raises aggregate productivity. And if the bad firms exit and the good firms enter, that raises aggregate productivity. And the final channel is reallocation. So if resources move from the less productive firms towards those more productive, that increases aggregate productivity. If the best firms get bigger, on aggregate, productivity increases. So to try and diagnose the productivity slowdown, we'll look at these various channels for East Asia. And to do so, we've used harmonized firm level data from several East Asian economies, including China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And in the presentation today, I'll be presenting averages across the region, but I encourage you to look at the report if you're interested in a particular country. So when we look at East Asia and these different channels, we'll see that entry and exit didn't contribute very much to aggregate productivity growth. Entry only about 15%, and the exit of inefficient firms only 8%. Reallocation of resources, so whether more productive firms get bigger, actually negatively contributed to aggregate productivity. In fact, we found that the most productive firms in the economy actually reduced their market share. They actually shrank. In contrast, the vast majority of productivity growth is due to existing firms getting more efficient, which explained the bulk of productivity growth. So this is the first reason we find in our report for the productivity slowdown, that there's very little growth from these dynamic channels to do with entry and exit and reallocation. Almost all the growth comes from within firms. So now let's look in more detail at this middle part, this within firm growth, in particular at the frontier firms, what's going on there, and the other firms within the economy. But before we go to East Asia, it's helpful to recap what's going on in advanced economies. So in advanced economies, you'll see headlines like these from the Harvard Business Review and The Economist, stories about the best firms pulling away. So the best firms, superstar firms or global frontier firms, the most productive firms continue to be growing rapidly, despite what we've just seen as a slowdown in advanced economies, like the US, for instance. The best firms globally are getting more productive, and they're getting larger. So you have all these headlines here, and you have these this nice picture from The Economist of these the two snails, with the global frontier, the best firms being the snails that have managed to learn to ride a bike. And this connects to the changes that Indamit was talking about these best firms shifting their business models towards things like data analytics and data-driven decision-making and improved management practices. If we look now at East Asia, surprisingly, what we see is the complete opposite. So this is a chart here where we're looking at the productivity trends for different types of firms in East Asia. This is an average for 5 East Asian economies in China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam. As I said in the book, we have them individually, and we plot these trends separately for the frontier firms, the most productive 10% of firms, which is the red line, the average firm in the economy, which is the blue line, and the laggard, the least productive 10% of firms, which is the green line. And we've normalized this productivity to the first year. And what you can see for both manufacturing and services is that the productivity growth of laggard firms has been much faster than the rest. And the frontier firms in red has been at the bottom. So the frontier firms are growing relatively more slowly than other firms in East Asian economies. And this is true when we look in East Asia. It's true for every single economy that we look at. It's not just true on average. It's true for manufacturing and services in all the economies for which we have data. So you might think the catch-up of the laggard firms is good news, which it is. It's good news. But one concerning thing is what happens if we compare the national frontier in East Asia, so the best firms in East Asia, to the best firms globally, the global frontier. And we compare the productivity trends here. And what we can see is that the national frontier in East Asia are falling further behind the best firms globally, and especially in digital sectors. So this chart here shows the gap in productivity between the best firms globally and the best firms in East Asia within the same industries. And again, we've normalized it to the first year. And what you see here is you see all these downward lines, these negative lines. And what that means is the gap has been increasing. between the best firms globally and the best firms within East Asia and Pacific. So our East Asian heroes are not doing relatively well compared to their global counterparts. And this raises some concerns about the future growth of all firms, because we just talked about how new technologies and new, more efficient business practices tend to come first to the national frontier. So if the national frontier are not doing so well, that raises potential concerns in the future for all firms. So we had previously the chart from The Economist, which was focused on advanced economies, where we saw that most firms in advanced economies are stagnating in productivity, but the best firms globally, the global frontier, are pulling away rapidly. They've learned to ride these bikes. In contrast, what we see here in the national frontier in East Asia is they're not increasing their productivity substantially, and they're falling behind the best firms globally. And this matters for aggregate productivity in East Asia because these national frontier firms are large. They account for this 10% of most productive firms in East Asia, account for an average 58% of total output. So they explain the bulk of aggregate productivity growth. So this is the second reason why productivity growth has slowed in East Asia. The first being the limited role for entry and exit, and the more productive firms are not scaling up in size. And here we see the most productive firms are not growing their productivity relative to their global counterparts. So I'm going to pass now to my colleague Francesca, who's going to talk more about the technology diffusion in East Asia.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So what we see is was one of the reasons why the technology, the frontier firms are not pushing forward, is that they tend not to adopt the most sophisticated technologies. They are falling behind in technology use. And to support this claim, we have two different pieces of evidence. Let me start with the first one, which comes from the evidence from the firm level adoption of the technology survey run by the World Bank. Here on the x-axis, we are plotting firms in the order of their level of technological sophistication, where closer to the origin are firms that are considered technological laggards, while farther out are firms that are considered at the technology frontier. And we are comparing these firms with firms in the most advanced country is in our sample, which is Korea. Here we are showing the distance in technology sophistication between Vietnamese firms, within Korean firms and Vietnamese firms. And we see that when it comes to technology laggards, they are fairly relatively similar to each other. The gap is small, but the gap becomes bigger and bigger as we move farther out and increase the level of technological sophistication, implying that firms at the Vietnamese firm at the technology frontier are faring much worse than the Korean firms. And we find similar evidence also from Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, the other three countries that are in our sample. Now you may think like, okay, fine, this picture is about average firm, but we can count on the affiliates of multinational in order to pull further up and fare better, but actually even the affiliates of multinational are lagging behind. And we think that this is because of two separate reasons. First, in general, multinationals that are located in developing countries, and especially in the region, and this is true also for the region, tend to be less productive and are also less likely to use more advanced technologies such as AI. Second, these M&Es that are less sophisticated also don't transfer their most advanced technologies to the affiliates in the East Asia region. And using data on that allows us to match what kind of technologies transfer between headquarters and affiliates in the region, we see that only 50% of the affiliates use AI. Next. So the natural question then becomes, why are leaders not leading? What are their motivations? And we find that we need to have a complex answer that relies on two main reasons. First is that firms need the right incentive, and second, firms need the right capabilities in order to lead. And when we look at the incentives that firms need, we see that higher TFP growth is observed when you have a smaller presence of state-owned enterprises in the economy and a higher presence of foreign firms. But we do know that from analysis that in particularly some economies in the region, this pressure from are not felt as much, and we see a higher share of state-owned enterprises in the economy than that reduces the incentive for the frontier firms to grow. Second, next, when we look at the incentive that can come from the competition that can come from international trade in goods and especially trade in services, we see that there are barriers to competition that weakens this incentive for firms domestically. And we see that when we look at trading goods, international trading goods. So the region is well known for having a low tariff on good, but what a dimension through which they are restricting in competition is by having higher non-tariff barrier. And here you can see that there are several countries that for the level of given the level of income showed a disproportionately higher level of non-tariff barriers than one would expect. And we see even more when on restrictions that are given the level of income of the economy, restriction in service trade restrictions. When it comes to having the right capabilities, we present two different pieces of evidence today. First, we look at physical infrastructure. And here we are considering a foundational technology, high-speed broadband, which is a foundation for cloud computing, data analytics, all sorts of more complex technologies that can help boost productivity. And we see that high-speed broadband is unevenly distributed both within and across countries, implying that every country in the region has room for growth and room for improvement. When we look at the other important capabilities for firms, we look at, for example, management skills that have been shown in the literature to be critical for the adoption of more sophisticated technologies. And here we are comparing firms in the region with firms in the US and showing the difference between US firms and firms in the region, depending on their level of productivity. So a firm at the bottom of the productivity distribution in China fares relatively similar to a Singaporean firms with respect to a US company. Sure. But when we look at the most productive firms, we see that the Chinese firms are doing almost 3 times as worse than a Singaporean firm relative to a US firm, indicating that there is significant room for growth. So what can be done? What are the policies that can be implemented in order to redress this situation? And we see that we need to, we argue that we will need to have a multi-pronged approach that promotes competition, supports the development of stronger skills, and the development of adequate infrastructure. So when we look at the reason to what needs to be done in order to promote further competition, we see that frontier firms are disproportionately more likely to cite access barriers to access international markets and trade regulation, to access adequate skilled labor force, and identify weaknesses in transport and telecommunication infrastructure. When it comes to building and promoting, further promoting competition, we see that there is a lot of room for improvement by doing undertaking reforms in international trade and investment in order to improve productivity. For example, analysis that shows that there are significant productivity in growth improvements from a tariff reduction, both in the sectors that have experienced the tariff reduction and in the downstream sector. That is, the sectors that buy input from the sector that experienced the tariff reduction. We find similar evidence also from a service liberalization in the negative effect on laggards firms experiences the service liberalization are more than compensated by the positive effect on other companies as well as the downstream companies in the buy services from the sectors that have been liberalized. And last but not least, it's in the sequencing and synchronization of this reform is quite important in order to yield significant synergies. Here we are showing that there is a significant association between investment in data analytics and in productivity growth when the firm is foreign-owned or when the firm has broad access to fiber broadband. However, what we see is that these effects are more than are magnified, are much larger than the sum of the two different components when they happen jointly. That is, when a foreign firm has access to fiber broadband, it is much more productive and observe a much higher increase in productivity and a much higher increase in investment in data analytics. So in conclusion, what we have shown today, we have shown that the most productive firms in the region are not leading, and this is especially true in a digital intensive sector. We have argued that what happened at the frontier matters, and it matters because frontier firms are responsible for a large share of output, and they play a critical role in diffusing new technology in the region. In order to redress this situation, we need to act on two fronts. We need to provide both right incentive and adequate capabilities for firms in order to improve their performance. And when we plan on how to do so, we need to recognize the fact that synchronized reforms can pay larger payoff. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Francesca and Jonathan, for that excellent presentation. We are fortunate today to have with us two remarkable people, each an authority on these issues. I would like you to hear from them rather than about them, but let me say briefly that Dr. Raden Pardede is a senior advisor to the Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs of Indonesia, a position he's held since 2014 when he wrote the book, The Economic Choices Facing the Next President. He's also a multidimensional personality. He's the founder and managing partner of Greco Research Institute, and he also serves as the independent commissioner of a bank and of an e-commerce company. And I should also say that he's an economist and an engineer. So we are fortunate to have you with us, Dr. Pardede. And Dr. Lilian Yang serves as Secretary General of International Economic Association and lead advisor at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. She was appointed as the lead advisor to the Minister of Trade in Indonesia, and she was also a senior advisor on trade and investment at the President's office. Dr. Ng has written many remarkable articles, and especially a book recently she's edited with Gene Grossman on robots and AI, and has also done a lot of pioneering work on understanding trends in global trade. So let me begin with you, Ibu Lidi. You heard what our report finds, that there's very little contribution in the region from startups, and also very little contribution from reallocation, which is, labor and capital moving from less productive firms to more productive firms. So how do you think that business dynamism has evolved in Indonesia? And why is the business ecosystem not more dynamic?
Thank you for having me. Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate you and the World Bank team for the launch of this very important report, which I believe it will be widely cited by scholars, as well as serve as key reference for policymakers. Congratulations. Responding to your questions on dynamisms in Indonesia in particular, I think the reasons are twofold. First is the structural barriers, complexity in regulations, and the dominance of state-owned enterprises. It's kind of limit the competitions and innovations of firms. And that is why it presents that in Indonesia, it's kind of the structural paradox in which like 99% of firms are still small, medium enterprises, and only 0.1% that grow becomes medium size. The second reason is that the very weak linkage between small, medium enterprises to access of finance. This is one thing I think that has been an issue not only for Indonesia, but for the major of developing countries. Because of accessing the finance, the firms cannot grow, and also they're very limited access to trainings as well as upgrading their skills. So this kind of structural barriers, as well as limited access to finance and skills, this kind of combinations really limit small, medium enterprises to grow. Not only Indonesia, I think like these cases also happens in Southeast Asia and in major developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Lili. You focused a bit on small and medium enterprises, but maybe, my next question, why do the leading firms, who presumably are better able to access finance and maybe better able to navigate regulations, why are they falling further behind the leading firms globally?
To be honest with you, I need to go through the details of your reports. This is something that I'm not very convinced about that, particularly on the statements of in the digital intensive sectors, because from what I learned is that China, Japan, and Korea, all three together contribute to 75% of the adoptions of industrial robots globally, 75%. I mean, it's a huge contributions, right? So in that kind of particular why they're not leading or compare with vis-a-vis US companies, this is some things that I'm not very convinced with the results of the reports. I think like one is that in terms of industrial robot adoptions, the second one, if we see in the digital intensive and AI automations intensive, taking examples of China, South Korea, Vietnam, even like developing countries in East Asia, like Vietnam's, they are very advanced in AI, industrial robots, and digital transformations. I think like taking examples in solar panel in EV, in payment systems, and other digital related digital, including digital trade. So I think this is something that to be honest with you, I'm not very convinced with the results of the reports. There's something that I need to go through. Thank you.
I'm glad I provoked you to say that, so please don't hold back. One clarification, this report isn't about Japan and Korea, and I hope you will have time to look at it. It's really about developing East Asia, but the China examples you give are completely relevant. We have another report which we launched last week, which looked explicitly at adoption of robots and AI in the region. And really, China stands out along with Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. But Indonesia is really falling behind. But it also has to do with the kind of industries that Indonesia and Philippines have. And I think it would be interesting to see why these other countries in the region have actually not witnessed as much technology adoption. And one of the surveys that my co-author spoke about was precisely on Indonesia. So I had hoped also to provoke you to talk a little bit about how connectedness of firms, political connections, often exposes them to less competition. So maybe I can now turn to Radan. And, we see the good news. In fact, Ibu Lily was worried about the smaller firms. They seem to see faster productivity growth. But it's the leading firms which are falling further behind the best global firms. Now, Ibu Lily has already expressed some skepticism. Is this consistent with your views of where regional firms stand? And what do you see as the main barriers to growth for the leading firms in Indonesia?
Yes, I think based on my observation, it seems to me that the regional firms follow your result. It means firms in the imitations and diffusion stage are going much faster than firms in the innovation stage. The closer your distance to the production possibility frontier, the slower you are, and more difficult to reach the frontier. I think this finding is not surprising at all. But you're finding that a national leading firm, and more importantly, even the M&E subsidiaries, falling behind the best global one is really worthy and important to understand, because this conclusion will have a significant impact to the future technology development and hence the economic development on one country, especially in Indonesia. On your question about the barrier to growth for leading firm in Indonesia, I think I agree with you. I could say it's a wrong incentive. When there are easy and guaranteed and stable success, why should determine to difficult and no success guarantee? Income from abundant natural resources you may get from government license without proper competitions, and you get the monopoly power in particular sectors, making it less attractive for people to do long-term investment and also go to the new technology. So a natural resource endowment, I think, can bring about delays in the technology adoptions. I think this is consistent with historical record that resources-rich countries were overtaken by the poor resources countries or reversal of fortunes. And of course, lack of competitions and domination of SOEs also quite dominant in Indonesia. I think this is in line with your findings in your books. And of course, the basic human capital, technology, and learning capability are also important, in addition to capability of entrepreneurs. The latter is, in my view, also related to my previous argument. Our entrepreneur, which mostly train in a less competitive natural resource environment, are impatient and less eager to take a risky investment. I think they are the main, in my view, the main barrier to growth in the leading firm in Indonesia.
Thank you, Radin. I am relieved by your answer, but also a bit saddened by these developments, which I agree with you. A lot of this report looks at what has happened so far, but if, in your view, if we look ahead to these new technologies that Ibu Lili was also talking about, especially AI and smart manufacturing, where AI meets the robot, how do you see this? Do you think this will widen the gap between advanced country firms and those in East Asia, or will it democratize technology because access to these technologies might be easier, or incentives or capabilities less of an issue, or the other way around?
I believe in the beginning, Indonesia and also other emerging developing countries in East Asia Pacific have a chance to catching up and even leapfrog, such as in AI and smart manufacturing. This is common. When a new wave of technology changes rapidly, I think this is there is a chance for countries to take a leapfrog. The old technology, of course, become obsolete very rapidly. And this trend has been experienced, I think, in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan in the past, which is the Taiwanese, Japan, and Korea also take a leapfrog when there is a rapid technological change. And of course, it is up to the country whether they can adopt this new common technology rapidly, or whether the country take an aggressive actions to prepare for human capital, as we discussed before, infrastructure, and also favorable ecosystem. In addition, the state or the country might have to participate directly in providing fiscal investment in this new emerging technology. And it seems to me we cannot leave everything to the market and private sector alone. Active participation in the state is very important. I think we have seen this one in US right now, in Japan, and even in India. My understanding that new technologies such as AI will require a significant new and young talents. Indonesia, with young population and significant number of STEM university students, has a potential to be trained in this new emerging technology. And of course, maintaining high quality education and training system and program to support entrepreneur skill are also very important. Fiscal incentive, as we discussed before, direct participation of government as co-investor, both in infrastructure and in technology process and R&D development, will play a crucial role, in my view. And investment in data center, again, is also crucial. And data is the new oil, of course, as we now believe in that. And this is very important in order for to use domestic data to train the AI software. Hence, Indonesia and other developing countries should take this opportunity to benefit from AI and other emerging technology. And this is the time, in my view, because again, the AI as smart manufacturing, as you see, is quite different with the previous technology. This is very rapidly developed, and this is a time for us actually to take a leapfrog, and this is a time for Indonesia as well.
Thank you, Paran. There are other people who have made the nice argument that you're making, but you're adding to it valuable texture, and some of the policy issues you talked about we'll come back to. But let me go back to Ibu Lili. Ibu Lili, you are an authority on trade, and there is a period where people have thought that the coming of AI and robots might reduce outshoring and lead to more reshoring. And you have worked on this area. So my question for you is, how are these new technologies likely to affect trade opportunities for firms in East Asia? Because as you know, this region has thrived through trade. So we already have the specter of protectionism. Are these new technologies an offset, or are they going to compound the problem in terms of opportunities for firms in this region?
Before I respond to your questions, let me share with you one simple observations. If we see over the last 50 years, the global economy grew from $3 trillion in 1970 to 110 trillion in 2024. Much of this growth was contributed by openness in trade, investments, and movement of skills. Economic integrations was the cornerstones of the global economy. Looking ahead 50 years from now and beyond, the global economic growth will be determined by digital transformations and AI. Core competitiveness will be defined by countries' digital skills and AI capabilities, right? And responding to your questions, in the case of Southeast Asia, in the case of East Asia and including Southeast Asia, I think the innovations of innovations of AI will gonna increase opportunities, particularly trade in East Asia. If we take into account a study by Traveler recently, it produced if firms adopt AI generated machines or AI related applications, it's gonna increase 27% of exports in services. Also from a lot of studies that we can see, in the case of East Asia, the innovations and adoptions of industrial robots and AI will gonna increase opportunities of exports. In the sense, it's gonna increase product sophistications, product variety. At the same time, it's gonna reduce product prices. So by that kind of combinations, I think in general, it will gonna increase trade in goods as well as trade in services. Thank you.
That's interesting. You both share an optimistic view of what these new technologies are going to do for both productivity, capacity, and opportunities. But there are challenges, and Paradan also already mentioned the potential role of the state and the question of how much can be left to the market and how much will require more direct intervention by the state. Now, and that arises in this whole capacity building, whether we are talking about skills or we are talking about the need for fast broadband that Jonathan and Francesca talked about. Now, Ibu Lili, you've written papers on Indonesia's infrastructure deficit in the past. How do you see countries managing this trade-off? On the one hand, you need quality infrastructure and quality education, but you also need improvements of wider access, especially for these small and medium enterprises and people who cannot afford, expensive schools and universities. How do you think Indonesia and other countries in the region might manage these difficult choices, and what role can the state play?
That's a very good point indeed. This is the thing. I think when we discuss about AI, industrial robots, and digital transformations in the regions, the issues is that three things. One is data privacy. The second one is competitions. The third one that is very important is digital divide. In the case of digital divide, I think that's why the results of studies, the results of assessments, it's just so very varied across countries. Like, for example, China, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. And if we take into account Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, the results will be so very much different because of digital divide. This kind of issues has been very evident. The issues is that some countries like China, Singapore, that are relatively advanced compared to the rest of countries in the regions, they kind of have cumulated skills and cumulated investments. That is very hard for other countries to catch up. I'm checking examples and highlights about Indonesia. There are two issues here. One is physical infrastructures. The second one is digital infrastructures. That's something that I think like Indonesia and other developing countries need to work out in terms of digital infrastructures that covers digital connectivities as well as digital skills that the government should really work hard to improve both digital connectivity as well as digital skills.
Thank you, Ibu Lily. I agree with a lot of what you've said, and I may come back to some of the questions or issues you identified about data and competition. But Pakran, you know, East Asia has benefited a lot from rapid export growth in the past. I mentioned the surge in protectionism, but there's also been a surge in industrial policy in industrial countries and also in Indonesia. How do you see the impact of these industrial policies? And how would you, in the capacity of an advisor, advise governments to design industrial policies so that you reap any positive benefits and minimize the downside risks?
Thank you. It is true in our experience in a bad time during the crisis, we make a good policy. Yeah. And there is a good reason to make a good policy in the crisis usually, because we can explain the cost of no reform. So I think, for example, your paper here, the result, if you just again, like Ibu Lily mentions, if everybody understand the result of your paper and distribute to many people, I think it will be good for us, to Indonesia and also to the firm in Indonesia, because there will be incentive for them to even make further development in improving their productivity. Effective communication, I think, is very important, but of course have to be based on the solid research. Yeah, and successful industrial policy reform, for example, usually have to be accompanied by consistent, coordinated effort to persuade stakeholders the need of reform. In particular, we need to communicate the cost of status quo. If we do nothing, what will happen in Indonesia? I think Mr. Indermit Kil already mentioned about Indonesia might be lag behind, and probably because of the leading company, Indonesia is lag behind, and hence the productivity of Indonesia is lag behind, and then Indonesia might be in the middle income trap. That's very important to explain to the people. And of course, we have to also at the same time explain what is the benefit of reform to the stakeholders. And again, make use of the involvement of international pressure and technological change. I mean, the benchmark that we can see comparing Indonesia with other countries, I think also will play an important role in order to induce reform domestically. And peer review and benchmarking, again, can stimulate reform. Yeah. But of course, successful meaning reform also requires strong institution and leadership, which is capable of supporting and reform and from decision to implementation. Effective institutions is, in my view, often required to guide and monitor implementation coherently and persistently. The importance of strong leadership, of course, is also very important. Whether an individual policymakers or institution charged with carrying out the reform also, I think it's important for us as well. But at the same time, to do reform or to have an effective reform or industrial policy reform, for example, we need to be patient and persistent based on my experience. It's often said the government must seize the opportunities and create it when the time comes, but it's not easy. Successful reform often takes several attempts. So have to be patient and persistent to do reform from time to time. And that's all our experience and my experience as well when we do reform in Indonesia. Have to be patient and persistent.
Thank you, Paradan. If I can just ask just one follow-up question. There are different forms that industrial policy have taken. For example, in China's case, there was a lot of state support, at least initially, to the development of electronic vehicles and batteries. The previous US administration was going to give large subsidies to encourage new technologies in certain areas. Indonesia has relied on, for example, export restrictions in minerals to try and encourage downstream processing. It has also sometimes imposed local content requirements. So just a quick question, your assessment of how far you see, especially the regional measures, have they produced big benefits and at an acceptable cost in the sense that they've had a positive rate of return?
I think recently our president, especially after we have negotiations, this is regarding to the trade policy from the US. Indonesia, I think we respond by also addressing as you mentioned about some of the barrier and also some of the related to the domestic domestic resource content. What is that? So we president in May after facing the pressure from the international, after facing the pressure from the after the trade war, Indonesia has responded as quite good in the sense that now Indonesia review all the policies that might not work, and including, as you mentioned, some of the policy that you already discussing before. So sometimes again, as I mentioned before, the benchmarking and international development also help us to do reform in Indonesia. So when we see some benchmark and also some pressure that we need to do more competitive because other countries doing much better than us, then this kind of stimulate reform in Indonesia as well.
Thank you, Paradan. If I can give the last word to you, Ibu Lili, and I'm going to move now from policy to research. Now, one respect in which Indonesia stands out is in terms of the quality of data that is made available for researchers. And that also means that researchers like you have benefited, but researchers in other countries in this region are struggling to get good microeconomic data, especially linked data, whether it's in households or firms. I've heard this story about the RAND Corporation doing these long-term surveys, or began in Malaysia, but then did not continue, but moved to Indonesia. So that has certainly been a boon for researchers. What is your advice to the rest of the region? How much has Indonesia benefited from openness in data by the quality of advice that researchers like you have been able to produce, and that availability of data is a bigger handicap for other researchers? So what would you say?
Well, I believe that good policies should be based on evidence, and evidence will be able if we could have access to data, right? I'm kind of person who against that the governments should just take policies just for the sakes of political power or decided by political like political pressures. This is some things that Indonesia, I think like Pak Raden, Pak Khatib Basri, Bu Mari Pangestu, a lot of good Indonesian economists have been working based on the database that provide contributions to policies. Whether at the end of the day that policies responded to our recommendations, but at least like we provide a good balance in designing policies. So I think my simple advice, again, I do believe that all policies should be based on evidence, and the evidence should be based on the data. Data cannot lie.
Thank you very much, Ibu Lili. No, I agree completely. And I'm grateful to you and Pak Raden for a really stimulating, richly textured set of comments. I hope with time you will be able to look more closely at the work we have done. And I hope this process of trying to create evidence-based policy advice will continue both in our institution and in the region. And I also thank our presenters, Francesca and Jonathan, to Brad, who manages the Zoom, and Maria Laura, who manages and organizes everything. Thank you very much, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you all at our next presentation of our final report in this series called Green Technology. And that is about decarbonization in the region and how you can be reconciled with development. Thank you again, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.